He stepped into the office, unsure of who he would find on the other side of the desk. His hands trembled, and in his chest, there was only one feeling: fear. Once, he had been a director, a man whose word determined the fate of others. But now, his own career depended on the woman he had once humiliated and thrown out the door. He lifted his gaze and met her cold eyes. What she said next turned everything upside down. But let's start from the very beginning. Alicia's footsteps echoed loudly in the hallway of the elite office center. Tall glass walls, expensive paintings, impeccably dressed employees rushing between offices. Everything here screamed status, power, money. She clutched the folder with her resume and exhaled. Everything had to go perfectly. She had prepared, read dozens of articles about the company, studied their market, crafted a strategy. This was her chance, her future. But the moment she stepped into the office, her confidence collided with the cold, assessing gaze of the man behind the desk. Daniel Harris, the company's director, the man who decided who was worthy of working here. He didn't offer her a seat. "Alicia Williams," he drawled, handing her resume back without even glancing at it. "Harvard, huh? Internship in Los Angeles?" "Yes, sir. Do you really think you belong here?" She frowned. "Excuse me?" Harris finally looked up at her. There was no curiosity in his gaze, not even interest, just boredom and a hint of disdain. "I don't need excuses. I see you." Alicia felt something inside her grow cold. "I don't quite understand. I'm saying we don't have open positions for people like you." He leaned back in his chair lazily. "Maybe somewhere else you'll find a job that suits you." Her slender fingers curled into a fist. "People like me?" He smirked, barely noticeable. "Listen, Miss Williams. We're looking for people with experience. People who know how to work in the real world, not just hide behind diplomas and quotas. Quotas." The word hit her like a punch to the stomach. "I graduated from Harvard with honors." Her voice trembled for a moment, but she steadied herself. "I interned at a leading agency. I have client recommendations." "Recommendations?" He chuckled and shook his head. "Seriously? Do you really think that matters to me?" He tossed her resume aside and folded his arms across his chest. "You don't belong here. The door is over there." Alicia stood in complete silence. She couldn't move. She couldn't even breathe. She hoped he was joking, that this was a test, that any moment now he would say, "Well, Miss Williams, let's discuss your strategy." But no. His icy gaze said it all. "You are nothing." The air in the office grew heavy. Anger pulsed in her temples, but alongside it, helplessness. She could tell him exactly what she thought, demand an explanation, but she knew it wouldn't change anything for him. Slowly, she turned and walked out, and only when the door shut behind her did she realize she had clenched her fists so tightly that her nails had dug into her palms. The night felt endless. Alicia sat on her bed, staring into the darkness. Somewhere in the kitchen, water dripped from the faucet. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, but she didn't hear any of it. There was only one voice in her head. "You don't belong here. The door is over there." Every word from Harris echoed in her mind, reverberating like a cruel reminder. She could still see his cold smirk, his disdainful gaze, the way he hadn't even given her a chance. Her eyes burned. She yanked the blanket off, stood up, and walked to the mirror. She looked exhausted, red eyes, tense lips, trembling hands. Why? Why does this keep happening? She had studied at the best university, worked harder than anyone else. Why had a single glance been enough to erase it all? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the thoughts away. But they wouldn't leave. The next morning. By morning, her anger had only grown. She stepped outside, inhaled the crisp air, and pulled out her phone. Opened her email, opened the folder with her projects. She wouldn't complain. She wouldn't beg for a second chance. She would create one herself. She sent her resume to several other companies, only to receive standard rejection letters. That's when she decided, if the doors were closed, she would build her own. The first steps. She pulled out her last savings, rented a tiny office in an area no one even looked at, and got to work. At first, it was brutal. She had no name, no reputation. Companies didn't want to trust her with their projects. But she knew, if no one was willing to give her a chance, she would make her own. She spent nights crafting marketing strategies, analyzing the market, searching for clients. She did free projects just to earn trust. A year passed, then two. She no longer needed anyone's chances. She built her own company. Major brands started reaching out to her. Her agency was growing at an incredible pace. Alicia had become someone who could no longer be ignored. But the best part. One day, she received an email. It was from Harris's company. The very company that had once rejected her was now on the verge of bankruptcy. They were looking for help. And him, Daniel Harris, had submitted his resume to her company. At that moment, Alicia realized this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The office was spacious and bright, nothing like it had been in her early days. Large windows offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan, and beneath her feet was polished marble. Alicia sat behind a massive walnut desk, reviewing a list of applicants. Another interview. Another candidate. "Miss Williams, the next applicant has arrived." Her secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Send them in." When the door opened, her breath caught. Him. Daniel Harris. His once perfect posture now carried tension. His expensive suit still fit impeccably, but his eyes, there was something new in them. Weakness. He lowered his gaze and stepped inside. "Miss Williams." His voice was quiet, almost humble. "Director Harris." Alicia deliberately paused. "Oh, my apologies. Not a director anymore, are you?" She saw the slight twitch of his jaw, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm here to apply for a position at your agency." She leaned back in her chair, slowly crossing her arms. "Interesting. You want to work for me?" Harris nodded without looking up. "Your company is one of the best in the market. I've studied your strategies. You have built something impressive." Alicia smiled. "Oh, so now you acknowledge my professionalism. Funny, considering 5 years ago you told me I didn't belong in your company." Harris tensed. "That was a different time." "A different time?" Her voice remained even, but inside she was boiling. "So when I asked for a chance I wasn't even worth listening to, but now that you're in the same position, it's suddenly a different time?" Harris clenched his fists. "I understand that I was wrong." Alicia traced her finger along the smooth glass surface of her desk, pretending to consider. "You know, Mr. Harris, we do have an open position. I need a new director of development." She saw the flicker of hope in his eyes. "I'm ready to work hard, Miss Williams. I've changed." She let the silence stretch before speaking. "Good. But we have one rule." "What is it?" "All newcomers must go through a probationary period, as unpaid interns." Silence crashed through the room like a thunderclap. Harris paled. "Unpaid?" Alicia smiled, cold, emotionless. "Yes, 3 months. If you've truly changed, I assume that won't be a problem." He clenched his jaw but said nothing. "So, do we have a deal?" Slowly, as if it was burning him from the inside, he nodded. Deal. Alicia extended her hand, and Harris, gritting his teeth, shook it. She watched as he walked out of her office, the very office where he had once told her she wasn't good enough. Now, he was in her place. And for the first time in 5 years, Alicia felt that justice had finally been served. Harris sat in a small office that had once been designated for interns. Now, it was his office. No panoramic windows, no expensive furniture, no assistant waiting to fulfill his every request. Just a desk, a chair, and a stack of paperwork. For the past 2 weeks, he had been doing the most mundane and lowest-paid tasks in the company. He had become something he had never considered himself to be before. An ordinary employee. Today, he had been summoned to Alicia's office. He stepped inside and hesitated near the door, as if unsure whether he was allowed to go any further. "Take a seat," she said calmly, without lifting her eyes from the monitor. He sat. Alicia slowly closed her laptop and looked at him. "How do you find the work, Mr. Harris?" He swallowed hard. "Interesting," he forced out. "Really?" Alicia leaned slightly forward. 5 years ago, you told me I wasn't capable of working in marketing, and now you're doing tasks that no one even bothered offering me back then." Harris clenched his fists but didn't look away. I was wrong." Alicia studied him carefully. "So, you admit that your judgment back then was incompetent?" He held his breath. "Yes." For the first time, he said it without irritation, without excuses, just yes. Silence filled the room. "I want to know why," Alicia suddenly said. "Why? What? Why did you reject me back then?" Her voice was cold, but there was something else beneath it, something deeper. Harris ran a tired hand over his face. "Because," he exhaled, "because I was afraid of competition." She frowned. "What?" He leaned back in his chair. "You were better than my employees, better than me. And I didn't want to see someone like you succeed when I had spent my whole life playing by different rules." She stared at his face. He no longer looked arrogant, no longer had the confidence of a man who ruled everything. Before her sat someone who had lost, and yet she felt no triumph. She had expected to want to see him humiliated, crushed, expected this moment to be her ultimate victory, but instead, she felt only peace. "You've passed your probation period," she finally said. Harris slowly lifted his eyes to her. "What?" "Starting today, you're officially on staff." He struggled to find words. You're not going to fire me?" "Why would I?" She shrugged. "You're a good specialist, as long as you work as part of a team and don't put yourself above others. Now you have a chance to prove it." He nodded, still not fully believing it. "Thank you." Alicia tilted her head slightly. "I don't need your thank you, Mr. Harris. Just do your job." He slowly stood up and headed for the door. His hand was on the doorknob when he hesitated. "Miss Williams." She lifted her gaze. He nodded slowly. "You truly deserve this place." She didn't reply. She simply watched as he walked out. And then, left alone, Alicia leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She no longer needed to prove her worth. She had already won.